Apple is worth $3 trillion. They have also been 90 days from closing entirely. The same company, nearly bankrupt, nearly never existed, nearly destroyed by the man they hired to replace its founder. Every time Apple was finished, something unlikely saved them. Here is every time, in full detail. The garage that almost never was. Steve Wozniak had no interest in starting a company. He had a job he loved at Hewlett-Packard. He was loyal to the company. He planned to stay forever. In 1975, he designed the Apple I, a personal computer he built for himself and shared freely with fellow enthusiasts at the Homebrew Computer Club. Before doing anything else with it, he took it to his employer. HP turned him down 5 times. Not once, not twice. 5 separate times Wozniak went back to Hewlett-Packard and asked if they wanted to make his computer. 5 times they said no. HP's reasoning: they couldn't see why ordinary people would need a personal computer. It was Steve Jobs who saw the commercial potential. Jobs pushed, convinced Wozniak's friends and family to pressure him, and eventually got him to agree. On April 1st, 1976, Apple was founded. HP later called their decision one of the most expensive mistakes in technology history. The first computer Apple sold generated $666.66 per unit, a figure Wozniak later said he chose purely because he liked repeating digits. The company that would become worth $3 trillion started because one employer didn't see the point, running out of money before anyone knew the name. By late 1976, Apple was a real company with a real product, but it was also running out of money. Jobs and Wozniak had sold the Apple I to a local computer store and were preparing the Apple II, a more powerful machine they believed could transform personal computing. The problem was simple. Building it required money they didn't have. Jobs was introduced to Mike Markkula, a retired Intel marketing manager who had become wealthy and was looking for something to do. Markkula met Jobs and Wozniak, sat with their business plan, and became convinced that Apple would be a Fortune 500 company within 5 years. His wife thought it was risky. He asked her for 4 years to try. Markkula invested $250,000 in Apple, $80,000 as direct equity, and the remainder as a secured bank loan. He also became Apple's third employee and wrote the company's founding marketing philosophy in a memo to Jobs. In return, he received 1/3 of the company. That third stake, had he held it, would eventually be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Without Markkula's $250,000, there is no Apple II. Without the Apple II, the company that everyone knows does not exist. The Apple II went on to become one of the best-selling computers in history and made Apple the fastest-growing company in American history at that point. Steve Jobs gets fired from his own company, and Apple slowly falls apart. By 1985, Apple had launched the Macintosh and was the most talked-about company in the technology industry. Behind the scenes, the relationship between Steve Jobs and CEO John Sculley, the man Jobs had personally recruited from Pepsi, had collapsed entirely. The two disagreed on strategy, on products, on how to run the company. Apple's board was forced to choose. They sided with Sculley. On May 31st, 1985, Apple's board stripped Jobs of all management responsibility. Jobs resigned. He left the company he had founded. For the next 12 years, Apple operated without him. The results were slow and then catastrophic. A parade of CEOs, Sculley, then Spindler, then Emilio, each tried to stabilize the company. Each failed. Apple released product after product that the market ignored. The company that had once defined personal computing watched Microsoft and the IBM-compatible PC industry take over the world. Market share fell from over 15% in 1993 to around 4% by 1997. Sculley, the man the board had chosen over Jobs, later said, "What I didn't realize is that Jobs was the heart and soul of Apple." By the time anyone admitted that, Apple had nearly run out of time. 90 days from bankruptcy, the most unlikely comeback in business history. By mid-1997, Apple had less than 90 days of operating cash remaining. They had lost nearly $1.9 billion over the previous 4 years. Their product lineup was a mess of overlapping models that nobody in the company could explain clearly to a customer. The board was discussing whether the company should simply be sold or shut down entirely. What they decided instead was one of the most counterintuitive moves in business history. Apple had been looking to acquire a new operating system from outside the company. The two main options were B Inc. and Next, the company Steve Jobs had started after leaving Apple. In February 1997, Apple acquired Next for approximately $400 million. Jobs returned as an advisor. By September 1997, the board had removed Gil Amelio as CEO. Jobs became interim CEO. His first moves: canceled over 70% of Apple's product line, told his team they would focus on 4 products: a consumer desktop, a professional desktop, a consumer laptop, a professional laptop. Nothing else. He also did something that shocked the entire technology industry. Bill Gates saves Apple at the most humiliating moment in the company's history. 2 months after Jobs returned, he walked onto the stage at Macworld in Boston. Behind him, projected on a giant screen via satellite, was the face of Bill Gates. The crowd booed. Microsoft was Apple's greatest rival. Gates had won the PC wars. Apple was losing. And now here was the most visible symbol of Apple's defeat, projected 20 feet tall at their own conference. The deal Jobs announced: Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple stock. Microsoft would commit to continuing to develop Office for the Mac for 5 more years. And the long-standing patent dispute between the two companies would be settled. Jobs later called the way the announcement was staged "my worst and stupidest mistake." He had put Gates on the giant screen to signal that Microsoft was validating Apple's future. The audience heard something different. Behind the drama, the deal made sense for both sides. Microsoft needed Apple to survive. If Apple disappeared entirely, Microsoft would have faced a devastating antitrust case with no viable competitor in the market. And Apple desperately needed the cash and the assurance to customers that Microsoft's software would keep running on Macs. The $150 million Microsoft paid in non-voting Apple stock was sold in 2003 for $550 million. If Microsoft had held those shares to 2024, they would have been worth approximately $20 billion. Apple lived, and what came next proved why. The iMac bet nobody believed in, the computer that looked like a toy. By early 1998, Apple was stabilizing but not yet safe. Jobs needed a product that would prove the company was back, something that captured attention, drove sales, and showed the world what Apple was capable of. The product Johnny Ive and his design team proposed was radical: an all-in-one computer in a translucent colored polycarbonate shell that came in Bondi blue. It looked unlike anything else in computing. It also looked, to many people inside Apple, like a toy. Retailers who saw early previews were skeptical. The conventional wisdom said consumers wanted beige boxes that looked serious. Jobs pushed the iMac anyway. It launched August 15, 1998 at $1,299. In the first 6 weeks, Apple sold 278,000 units. Over 20 weeks, they sold 800,000, making the iMac the best-selling Mac in the company's history to that point. Nearly half the buyers were first-time computer owners. Nearly 20% were Windows users switching to Mac for the first time. Apple went from losing $878 million in 1997 to making $414 million in 1998. One computer, one design decision, turned the losses into profits. The iMac also established the design philosophy, colorful, distinctive, human, that Apple products still carry today. The iTunes gamble. By 2001, Apple had the iPod. The hardware was brilliant. The problem was content. Buying music legally online was either impossible or so restricted by digital rights management that it was more convenient to pirate. Jobs believed he had the solution: a simple store, 99 cents per song, clean interface, easy purchase. The 5 major record labels, Universal, Sony, EMI, Warner, and BMG, needed to agree. They all said no initially. They were terrified of digital distribution. They wanted control so restrictive the store would have been unusable. Jobs spent 18 months personally negotiating with each label CEO. He convinced them that piracy was the alternative, that if they didn't give people a legal way to buy, people would simply take for free. He convinced them that 99 cents per track was the number that worked. Every label signed in the week before the iTunes Music Store launched on April 28, 2003. In its first 18 hours, customers downloaded 1 million songs. In its first week, 5 million. iTunes didn't just save Apple's music business. It killed the CD industry over the following decade. It built the foundation, the account, the trust, the billing relationship that Apple would use to sell every app, every movie, every subscription that followed. The store that nearly didn't exist became the infrastructure for everything Apple sells today. The iPhone that almost crashed on stage. January 9th, 2007, Macworld Conference, San Francisco. Steve Jobs was about to introduce the iPhone. In the audience, Apple engineers were drinking scotch, not to celebrate, to cope. The iPhone prototype Jobs was about to demonstrate to the world was profoundly unstable. It could play a portion of a song or a video, but not a full clip reliably without crashing. It worked fine sending an email and then opening the browser. Do those things in the wrong order, and the phone might freeze entirely. Drop calls happened randomly. The software would crash without warning. Apple's engineers had spent weeks mapping out a golden path, a precise sequence of actions, in a specific order, that gave the demo the highest possible chance of surviving without without failure. The phone displayed a fake 5-bar signal at all times, regardless of actual reception, so a radio crash wouldn't show on screen. Multiple backup iPhones were hidden on stage in case the primary device failed. Jobs had to follow the golden path exactly. If he deviated, the phone would likely freeze in front of a global audience watching the most anticipated product launch in years. He didn't deviate. The demo ran without failure. The iPhone was announced. 6 months later, it went on sale. The rest of the technology industry spent the following decade scrambling to respond. Apple Maps nearly destroyed the one thing Apple was known for. Apple's entire brand was built on the promise that things just worked. In September 2012, that promise broke publicly. Apple replaced Google Maps as the default navigation app on iPhone with its own Apple Maps. Launched before it was ready, the app directed drivers to wrong locations. Bridges appeared warped and melted in satellite view. A Meijer store in Illinois appeared in the middle of a lake. Multiple locations were placed miles from where they actually were. In Australia, the app directed drivers toward a location inside a national park with no road access. In extreme heat, with no water. Police issued a public safety warning. Tim Cook issued a written public apology, one of the only times an Apple CEO has ever personally apologized for a product, telling iPhone users to use competitor apps while Apple worked to fix its own. An Apple CEO publicly recommending Google's product to Apple's customers. When Google Maps returned to the App Store 3 months later, it broke download records. Apple's reputation for quality, the thing that justified every premium price, had taken a genuine hit. It took Apple approximately 10 years to build Maps into a product that could genuinely compete. The antitrust threat that could restructure everything. In March 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Apple, the most serious legal challenge to Apple's business model in the company's history. The DOJ's case targets 3 things: the 30% commission Apple charges on App Store purchases, the design of iMessage that creates friction between iPhone and Android users, and Apple's restrictions on competing apps and services within its ecosystem. The argument? Apple has used its position in the smartphone market to lock users in and lock competitors out in ways that violate competition law. Apple's counter: everything it does creates a better, safer experience for its users. If the DOJ wins, Apple could be forced to open the App Store to outside payment systems, change how iMessage works with non-iPhone users, and allow competing apps to access hardware features currently restricted to Apple's own software. The App Store generates an estimated $85 billion in annual gross merchandise value for Apple. A forced restructuring of the App Store alone could cost Apple billions in annual revenue. The case is ongoing. It is the first time since 1997 that Apple's core business model faces an external threat serious enough to alter the company fundamentally. Whether Apple survives this one intact depends on courts and regulators, not engineers. Apple has been turned down 5 times before it existed. It has run out of money before anyone knew its name. It fired the person it couldn't survive without and spent 12 years discovering that mistake. It watched its greatest rival write a check to keep it alive, on a stage Apple owned, at a conference Apple ran, in front of an audience that booed, and it still became the most valuable company in the history of the world. Every section of this story had a moment where a different decision ends everything. HP says yes in 1976. Jobs never convinces Wozniak they need a company. Markkula passes in 1977. There's no Apple II and no one to fund what comes next. Microsoft says no in 1997. Apple's cash runs out in 90 days, and the story ends. The golden path fails on stage in 2007. The iPhone's first impression is a frozen screen in front of the world. The pattern in every story is the same. The moment Apple looked most finished was always the moment that preceded everything important. That is either the most reassuring fact in business history or the most dangerous belief to carry forward. The phone that came out of all of this. Every iPhone generation explained is on screen right now.